blood bathing, the torture and murder of countless female servants and some nobility, and it was said that she inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula. Today we are talking about the haunted histories of Elizabeth Bathory, the Bloody Countess, as she is called. So strap in, it's a long one. I do have notes, but we know I'm going to get excited and lose my place. So, today, we're going to start at the beginning. Elizabeth Bathory, I've checked how to pronounce it, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, was a noblewoman from the house Bathory. Even when she got married, she kept her last name, which is rare, and just shows how important her family were. She did marry a count, and we're going to get into that in a moment. But it was said that she did inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula, although I can't find any evidence for that. Although she did do quite a lot of horrific things and probably inspired other things. So we're going to start at childhood because that is important. So she was born Elizabeth Bathory on the 7th of August 1560. So this is a long time ago. And yeah, so what I found interesting, actually, I think it might explain a lot if certain things are true, is she suffered from epilepsy. But obviously in the 1500s, they were using like leeches for headaches. So what they decided to do for epilepsy, which was called falling disease, probably because you fell down when you had a fit, probably. What they used to do, one of the things, was they would get the blood of an unaffected or unepileptic person and rub it on the epileptic person's lips. So, blood enters the story pretty early on in this whole saga, but that was one of the things that you were supposed to do if you had seizures in the 1500s. She was brought up in obviously a noble house, and in the 1500s it was quite brutal, so she was very accustomed and very used to seeing people of lesser ability and servants as less than human, really, and she was used to seeing them being beaten, being tortured. If they did something wrong, it was perfectly acceptable to beat or torture or even kill a servant. And if you would have killed a servant in those days, you wouldn't even get arrested. If you was a nobility, you would just get a fine for killing someone. And the money would be sent as like reparations to the victim's family. And that would be one of the harshest punishments, was just a fine. So she was very used to being quite comfortable seeing, brutalizing and seeing the brutalization of other people, other humans. So I think that's important to note. When she was 13 or 14, can't quite narrow down an exact date, she was engaged, I'm looking at the name, to Count Ferenc Nadeste. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I think I am. Obviously, it was a political arrangement. He came from a very wealthy, noble family. Royals even now, especially back in the 1500s, will marry for political reasons and, for gain and land and all that kind of stuff. So she was quite wealthy on her own. She had quite an estate. So did he. So apparently he gifted her a castle as a wedding present. They didn't live in that castle when she married him. She lived in his castle. Also, talking about family ties, her mother's uncle was Prince of Transylvania. So I think that's where a lot of the vampire folklore comes in. I forget his name, but he had lots of different titles, and he married a princess, and that made him Prince of Transylvania. Very interesting to know. So a very, very powerful family. Also in this time there was a lot of wars around all the countries surrounding them. I think it was Hungary they lived. I think so. But there was a lot of war going on between them and the Ottomans and lots of things like that. So, not long after they was married, let me find the date for you. Yes, in 1578, her husband was promoted as he became chief commander of the troops. So obviously he was away at war, and that left her, I think, was she been 18? Very young still, very young. That would have left her in charge of his estate, of all the finances and the protection of their land, which they had lots of land as well, not just the one castle she lived in. She was in charge of protecting that, and it was a real threat that it would come under fire, under siege. People try to invade it, take over it. It was down to this young woman to protect this land and her home, and make sure people saw her as a force to be reckoned with. Like, you are not going to get one over on me. I'm powerful, and you will know that. So one of the ways you would be powerful in those days is obviously looks. She was obviously a very pretty woman, and she used that to her advantage, but also showing displays of power. Obviously, everyone knew they had money. How else can you display it? Pain, basically scaring people. So, not long after her husband went away to war, she caught a servant stealing. I don't think it was anything big, but still, they stole something. And she had all the servants, all the staff, go to the courtyard and have this accused person absolutely tortured in front of everyone. And she ordered the guards to do it slowly, like it's slow, drawn-out torture, to teach people a lesson, like, you do not mess with me. And she would have had no problem doing that, because she was brought up seeing servants brutalised. So in her mind, this is just a necessary thing. Like, this is what I have to do to let people know where they stand, to show my power, and to teach them a lesson, like, you are not going to do that again. So, but I think she got a little bit too comfortable teaching people lessons, to be quite honest. Yeah, also, she would, I don't know if this was as a punishment or she just became a bit sadistic, because researching lots of other things as well and listening to a lot of true crime podcasts, in case you didn't know, clearly I'm interested in that. Yeah, there's quite a correlation between, like, brain injuries. So obviously if you have epilepsy and you have fits, it will affect the brain eventually, especially in those days. Like, I'm not talking about modern medicine now. I'm talking about, you know, they probably hit the head a lot if they fell, or we don't know the frequency of the seizures, so it could have affected the brain chemistry, and that actually can play into whether someone flips the switch, basically, and gets a bit dangerous. I'm not talking about epileptic people now, I'm talking about in the 1500s, where the frequency which they would have hit their heads when they fell and had these seizures would have been greater, and also the care would have been lesser, because they just didn't know what we know now. So please don't take it as me saying anyone with epilepsy can be a psychopath. I'm not. I'm saying her accumulation of life and health situations probably didn't help where her mind went. So yeah, whether it was to just be sadistic or to teach people a lesson, it was said she would sometimes coat servants in honey when it was like sunny and warm, and leave them for the ants and the flies and, you know, the little insects to basically teach them a lesson and bite them. And I don't know if they died out there for it or if they were just left there for a day. I don't know. But yeah, all different insects would be allowed to crawl on them and bite them and hurt them. And being coated in honey, you're going to attract a lot. So that was one method she used. Another one I found, which I found even crueler, was in the winter. And you can imagine up on the high mountain, like up in the high hills, in a castle in medieval times in Hungary in winter. It's probably pretty damn cold. She would have these people stripped, not only left in a courtyard all night, but have other servants throw freezing cold water onto these people until they froze to death, basically. That's pretty sadistic. I'm going to get into some controversy of whether she did certain things or not, but she definitely did hurt servants. She definitely did mistreat servants and was quite brutal to them. I'm going to get into some disputes about the blood bathing and stuff, but we're going to get there. So, another thing she was said to have liked was to burn people with candles in the flame of a candle. And sometimes, again, I don't know how true this is, but it seems fairly likely that she would also use fire tongs that you'd pick up the wood and put in the fire. She'd have them heated up and hurt her servants, or have someone else hurt her servants in that way, most likely to teach them a lesson. There's also a story of when a servant girl was brushing her hair and she just ever so slightly, the brush tugged because there would have probably been a knot, and she really did not like that, and without any warning she just slapped this poor girl and sent her flying. But again, to her this would have been normal, this would have been acceptable, and she wouldn't have thought twice about knocking the daylights out of a servant for slightly pulling her hair. So yeah, I don't think, although she did all these horrific things, I couldn't find any evidence, and there isn't any evidence that she did bathe in anyone's blood. Also, that rumour, shall we say, did come about, I believe, 100 years after her death. So I think it's one of those, like the telephone game, like you hear a story and people embellish it slightly and the next person embellishes it slightly. I do believe, however, I think she, because the epilepsy thing, she was told to rub blood on her lips, that might have helped feed into that story. Also, she apparently did try and use blood as like a beauty method, because I think it was rumoured she became quite paranoid about her looks, because obviously she is noble, part of her whole power is to do with her looks. So it was rumoured, I couldn't find any, concrete evidence. I think it may have been likely, though, that she did try and rub blood into her skin to help rejuvenate it, because if you're using a young, beautiful, healthy servant girl's blood, especially a virgin apparently, it had properties, and obviously in the 1500s, blood had all sorts of properties they thought it had when it just doesn't. You just need it in your body, you don't need to rub it on anything. So I think that sort of feeds into the whole blood bathing myth, and I think that's why a lot of people say she's like the first female vampire, or call her the blood countess, because she was quite bloodthirsty in her torture, but I don't believe she bathed in blood. I could not find any records to support that. I did come across research that said, because in the medieval time you could find like land ownership records, and I was being a landlord because she owned multiple different estates. No one seemed to have any real issue with her in the way of being a landlord. So I think a lot of the more fantastical rumours do need to be taken with a grain of salt, although I don't believe she was a very good person. I don't think she was culpable for all the crimes people are blaming her on now. Also, I found in what I could gather, she was accused of like between 50 and 150 deaths, whereas now when you look it up, it's between like 600 and 650 deaths. So I think it's been embellished over time, although it does sound fantastical and obviously movie worthy. I think there has been a few movies made about her. This fantastical version does sound more interesting, whereas I don't think it was quite to that level. However, I did find that she did take a lot of girls from the village to be servants. Again, I don't know if it was to bathe in the blood or use them for just torture victims, or because she did torture her servants so badly they just died early, so she needed more. So that's why so many young girls from the nearby villages were taken to replace them. I don't think it's because she was drinking the blood or bathing in it. I think she just really mistreated staff and she needed to replace it. So she used the local village girls to do that. The only reason she actually got in the trouble she got into was because apparently she started to mistreat or abuse some nobility. It was still lower nobility, but nobility is nobility, and they're more important than servants. No one cared that she hurt servants, no one cared if she killed servants, but you do that to nobility, even lower level nobility, people are going to start to look. So I think that's why certain eyes started to turn towards her, if you get what I mean. Just checking my notes. So on the 13th of December, she and 4 other servants were arrested for these crimes, because the way she got these girls, I'm going to explain, is she seemed to have like not a school, but you know when nobles would send their daughters to other houses to sort of train up in, teach lessons like, okay, this is a womanly skill you need to learn, like you need to learn this dance step, so when you go to court you can impress the right kind of person to get a good husband, a good match. You know, like learn sewing, learn languages. That was very important, actually. Apparently, German and Hungarian were the main 2 languages you should know at least. And I believe Elizabeth knew at least 4. So, you know, it would have made sense that other noble families would have sent the daughters to her to train up and, you know, learn from her. And apparently quite a few of these went missing or died in suspicious circumstances. So she blames it on cholera, which could have actually been the case, but she didn't help a situation when she wouldn't let people examine the body, she would just let them look at the faces. It might have been a religious thing, because she was Protestant, I don't know much about that religion. It might have just been that she wanted to not have these girls poked and prodded and keep some of the dignity, or it might have been because she did torture them and she didn't want anyone to know. I actually don't know. I can't find any solid evidence either way. But she wouldn't let anyone examine them. She would only let people look at the faces of these noble ladies and said they died of cholera. So obviously that sparked some feelings towards some of the nobles. You know, they've sent their daughters there in good faith. Believe some have even sent money to send the daughters there for them to be trained and looked after by the countess, but they ended up dying. So that's when investigations started to happen. And on the 13th of December, her and 4 other servants were arrested. It was also said that one of the servants, I forget the name, I'm sorry, they're also hard to pronounce, but one of the servants was said to inspire more cruelty in her. And she seemed to have a worse temper and a more of a penchant for cruelty and torture when this other servant arrived. So that's worth noting. But these 4 servants did stand trial and actually were convicted. But surprisingly, Elizabeth wasn't allowed to stand trial, and she did have a right to, but she wasn't allowed, and I do believe she wanted to. And I don't know if it was to protect the family name or another nefarious reason. She wasn't actually allowed to stand trial. But these 4 other servants were tortured. So any confessions that came out of them, they apparently did confess, but any confessions that came out of someone that's tortured, is it reliable? Because you've tortured it out of them, like in the witch trials, like, did they really confess to witchcraft, or was they just tortured so much they thought, I just want the torture to be over, and I'm just going to say, yes, I did it. So, I don't know. But I believe the male servant was sentenced to the chopping block, where he literally just was beheaded and that was over and done with. The women, however, seemed to endure a more torturous death. So I believe some had their fingers ripped off before being burnt alive. Some were whipped, some were hung, some were burnt alive. It was pretty sadistic. I don't know why the women's punishment was worse than the males, but we're talking about the 15th century, so sexism, I suppose. They must have seen them as more culpable, maybe, because they inspired the bloodlust. Don't know. But Elizabeth did want to be part of the trial. She did want to attend, but she wasn't allowed. And I think part of the reason, after my research, because I've got a lot of notes, was her and her husband, because they were so wealthy. Even other, like, really big, important households would lend money from them. And apparently, I know I've said that a few times now, she did visit quite a wealthy, I back, and I forget the name because I forgot to write it down. A really wealthy, powerful family. And she'd visited them on 4 occasions after her husband's death and requested that payments, to repay this debt be started, and nothing happened on that. And it just so happens that part of this investigation and trial included this family and their testimony and what they would get out of it if she was, convicted of these crimes. So it's very interesting to note that a few powerful families stood to gain from her downfall. So again, was it a conspiracy? Was it a plot? Because she was powerful, but she was also vulnerable because she was a widow, and vulnerable because she owned so much land and was so wealthy. So, wealth and power do things to people. And also she was Protestant, and I believe there was a lot of Catholicism then, and it was being pushed by certain families more than others, so that could have been a factor into it as well, because it's quite controversial that she was Protestant, I believe. So I think a lot of it had to do with what other families stood to gain if she fell, and the other half of it actually, yes, being guilty of horrific torture and horrific crimes, but they wouldn't have been classed as crimes because it was against peasants. The only reason she got in trouble was because nobility got involved in it. And I don't know if she did torture these noble ladies or if they did just die of cholera, but either way, they used the fact that she did actually, and have witness statements and testimonies that she did actually hurt these peasants. Of course, it would have stood to reason that these noble girls didn't just die a normal death, didn't just die of being sickly and of getting cholera. No, they was tortured to death, and she drank their blood and bathed in their blood and did all sorts of occult practices and witchcraft and all the things you'd need to say to take a woman of this station's power away and her wealth and cancel debts. And that's exactly what happened. This great and powerful family's debts were cancelled out as a bargain that Elizabeth not to be executed. She was put under house arrest. And I found 2 stories that I don't know which one's true. So one of them is she was put under house arrest and entombed in one of the larger rooms with just a hole to pass food through. And the other story is she was just house arrest and there was guards stationed, and there is actual paper evidence that there were guards in and around the castle. So I do believe that's probably more likely. So even if she was under house arrest, she still would have had quite a lavish life. She would have still been taken care of. She would have still had beautiful things and lovely food. I don't know if I believe the version that she was entombed in just one room of the castle for 4 years. I don't know. I think she would have had one of, at least most of the castle, like a bedchambers and a parlour or a dining room or something. I think that's probably more likely would have been the case. But either way, she was put under house arrest, and 4 years after that, she was found to have died in her sleep. So she was only under house arrest for 4 years, and she died at 54 years old, which is, for those days, I reckon it's quite old, but it's quite young for these days. But yeah, so 4 of her servants died brutally and torturously, and I believe because of her station, and because the people in power sort of got what they wanted. They took her lands, they cancelled debt, they acquired her wealth, basically. I think it's a combination of her, yes, being brutal and being quite bloodthirsty and quite aggressive and harsh, but I think it was who she had to be to survive, but it was also her downfall because she was then seen as a threat. And people wanted the debts cancelled, and, once your husband has died in those days, it's harder as a lady. So, sorry, there's some drills outside, it's distracting me. So yeah, it's harder when you're a woman So I think people took advantage of the fact that she was getting older and she had this bloodthirsty reputation, and people stood to gain from her downfall. So, sorry, I was a bit distracted at the end then. I was wondering what these noises were. People drilling outside my house. So yes, I hope you enjoyed this story of the bloody Countess, Elizabeth Bathory. It's sad. It's sad. Because even though she was definitely guilty of some nasty things, just, if you're a woman, you've always got to be aware of things, and you're always vulnerable to the whims of men, especially in those days. So I think she did well for the age she got to, and did well to just get house arrest. But also, she wasn't a good person, because she did torture people. She did commit heinous crimes. But that's, that wasn't important. If it was a servant, she wouldn't get in trouble because it was nobility, so that's important to remember. So I hope this wasn't too rambly. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sorry if I took some of the mysticism and spookiness away. I thought it was very interesting because I was expecting to hear about this bloodthirsty countess who committed all these although she did commit terrible crimes, like even worse crimes, like ritual sacrificing and bathing in blood. But no, she was just a ruthless tyrant, basically, that had power that other people wanted. And the facts got embellished. So I hope you enjoyed this Haunted Histories with me. I'm doing more. I'm going to try and do some spooky things for spooky season. I'm going to be working on a vampire one. Let me know if there's any particular spooky things you want, any sort of cryptid type stories. I'll have to think of code names for them because you're not supposed to say them out loud, are you? But if there's anything you do want to see, let me know. I hope you're enjoying yourselves. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you soon, my haunted pickles.